In the first phase of the Derek Chauvin murder trial, we heard emotional testimony from those who witnessed the ex-Minneapolis police officer kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds last May.
I believe I witnessed a murder.
If I would have just not taken the bill, this could have been avoided.
He said, "Mama, they're killing me."
Those gut-wrenching accounts are now being followed by a strict examination of Chauvin's use of force. And unlike many past cases of police violence on trial, and by the way, there aren't many, this time other cops have been willing to speak out against their fellow officers' actions, including the city's chief of police.
Once Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, and certainly once he was in distress and trying to verbalize that, that should have stopped. To continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy, it is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
Such testimony could play a major role in the jury's decision in this case, but could it play a factor in future police brutality cases too? I'm joined now by the director of ACLU of Massachusetts Racial Justice Program, Rahsaan Hall. Rahsaan, as always, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you too, Jim. Thanks for having me.
It's an unfair question, but what's your overall reaction to a week and a half of this so far?
It's honestly very distressing. I appreciate you for referring to it as the Derek Chauvin trial and for describing him as an ex-officer, because I think that's important in the conversation, that it's not George Floyd who is on trial, despite how it has been covered in some respects. But it's very challenging to see how the value of Black life is dealt with in policing. And I think the testimony around training and how this went beyond that training does a disservice to the way that regular, everyday policing happens and creates this harm. And so, to be honest, Jim, I really haven't engaged that much with this trial, because I know all of the things that it's bringing up for me and from what I've heard a lot of other people.
Yeah, but it seems to me that one thing that does separate this trial, Rahsaan, is, as I mentioned a minute ago, that there are a series of cops, currently cops, who are willing to break that so-called blue wall of silence, who have testified in very graphic, honest detail about how Chauvin crossed the line and then some. Is this aberrational, or is it possible that this could crack in that wall that may spill over in other cases?
You know, I'm hopeful that it's that crack in the wall. Is it a sign of progress that the chief of police and other police personnel are willing to testify against a former officer? Yes, I think it's emblematic of the shift that's occurred in our understanding of police's role and duty to those who they are sworn to serve and protect. But honestly, this is low-hanging fruit. I think it's easy for them to come out and testify against Derek Chauvin because he went so far. But it's those things that are within the veil of what they are authorized to do that still have the same result, that don't receive the level of scrutiny and criticism.
You know, I have to say, I think a lot about this. I have no idea, frankly, why cops are not willing to expose the bad cops, because in my estimation, it provides them greater ability to celebrate the good cops. I mean, the example I'll give you that we talk about a lot on this show is after the DA here decided several years ago, the interim DA, not to have another murder trial of Sean Ellis. The then top cop in Boston went out of his way to say, but he's still guilty, despite the evidence that there was corrupt cop in every corner of the room. Same thing a couple of weeks ago when Rachel Rollins decided that she would agree to a new trial and then dismiss charges on the remaining weapons convictions in the Sean Ellis case. Again, the acting top cop in Boston went out of his way to say guilty as charged, despite the uncontroverted, uncontradicted evidence of corruption on the part of all the cops involved in this case. So what explains this?
I think there is a belief within law enforcement that they are beyond reproach, even though they say that the bad cops make it harder for the good cops to do their job. Any show of weakness or vulnerability to that critique or criticism subjects them, from their perspective, to further scrutiny. And I think it's a commentary on the way that policing happens overwhelmingly in poor communities and communities of color. I think that's why the ACLU has pushed so hard for greater police accountability, whether it's this police decertification system, whether it's reform to qualified immunity, because we know that it's not going to happen on its own.
You know, I was a couple of months ago, Rosa Brooks, who's a professor at Georgetown Law School, wrote a book called Tangled Up in Blue. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but essentially she decided to become a cop. In D.C., you can volunteer, get the exact same training that other full-time police officers get, and then serve, I don't know if it's a day a month, a day a week, something like that. What she said surprised her is there was not a day that went by in training in which cops were not told that they're at risk every single minute, which she thinks explains in part why they shoot first and ask questions later in more cases than one would hope. And there was not one word in all the training, not one word about racism in policing in this country, which when I heard that, it sort of explains a huge amount to me. At the same time, I say, how is that possible in 2021?
And I think, we see that there are people in law enforcement who come out and say there are bad cops, but there's not structural racism or systemic racism throughout the department. And that's a perfect example of it. The lack of a willingness to address some of those concerns, the disparities in who gets arrested, who gets stopped, who gets harassed, who has complaints filed against them, who's disciplined within the department, all of those things. And to say that structural racism doesn't exist is turning a blind eye to the problems that are baked in to how policing happens.
You know, back home here, will the reform, albeit imperfect, on the state level and in the city of Boston, the police reform, assuming it's implemented as written, will that make a difference here?
The ACLU is hopeful that it will make a difference. Like we said, the Post Commission will be able to license and, more importantly, de-license or decertify police officers. We're hoping to see that come online. I think the new use of force standards are going to be a critical factor in holding officers to account and the duty to intervene. That was one of the problems with Derek Chauvin. He had other officers standing by, watching him cross the line and not do anything. Well, Massachusetts has changed that to make officers responsible for the actions of their fellow officers. And so hopefully we begin to see a shift. But until we reduce the footprint of policing and invest in community resources that address the underlying needs, we'll still see these types of situations.
Well, before we get to that place in the last minute, will the verdict in this case have an impact on policing around the country, regardless of what that verdict is?
I don't think so, honestly, because this is one of those examples where he was so clear beyond the bounds and beyond the policy. I hope that it will. I hope that it will make law enforcement officers think twice about how they conduct their job. But the reality is, until we start getting within the margins of day-to-day policing that leads to those types of death, police are going to still conduct themselves in the same way.
Rahsaan Hall, thanks for your work. Thanks for your time. As always, good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me, Jim.